The road to Widow's Draw peters out into little more than a cattle trail 11 miles past the last real town, and Margaret Cole rides the final stretch alone, her horse picking a careful path through low scrub gone silver with early frost. She had not expected to be here. 6 months ago, she had a husband and a small house in Prescott and a life that felt, if not exceptional, at least settled. Now, she has a deed to a ranch she has never seen, inherited through a chain of distant relations who wanted no part of it themselves, and $6 worth of curiosity about why land this size could possibly cost so little. The county clerk had not been encouraging. He'd looked up from his ledger only long enough to ask if she was quite certain, and when she said she was, he'd simply shrugged and stamped the paper. The particular shrug of a man who has decided a customer's regrets are not his business to prevent. Cresting the final rise, she sees the ranch laid out below her almost exactly as she pictured it from the deed's dry description. A modest house, a barn, a scatter of outbuildings, and running along the western edge of the property, disappearing into the distance in both directions, a long wooden fence line that seems, from this height, unremarkable in every way. She notices it mostly because there is so little else on the land to notice. She does not yet know that she will come to know every foot of that fence far better than she would ever choose to. The house holds 12 years of dust the way a held breath holds air, perfectly still, perfectly undisturbed, waiting. Margaret lets herself in through an unlocked front door and finds furniture still arranged for daily use, a stove in the kitchen, still holding a bed of long dead coals beneath a fine gray coat of ash, and in the front room, a child's rag doll propped upright in the corner of a settee, as though set down there for only a moment. She moves through the room slowly, cataloging what she finds without yet letting herself think too hard about what it means. Whoever lived here did not pack, did not sell off their furniture, did not strip the house of its comforts before moving on to better prospects, as any family fleeing failed land would surely do. They left as though called away suddenly, expecting to return within the hour. She spends the afternoon opening windows to air out the stainness, hauling water from a well behind the house that still runs sweet and clear despite the years of neglect, coaxing warmth back into rooms that have held only cold for over a decade. By evening, she has convinced herself that the discomfort settling in her chest is simply the discomfort any woman would feel moving alone into an unfamiliar house. Nothing more particular than that. She does not yet know the family's name. She will not learn it. Dunmore until the following week, from Ruth Calder's own mouth. She eats a quiet supper at their table, telling herself firmly that this means nothing at all, while outside, along the fence line to the west, the evening wind begins to pick up, carrying with it, faint and easily mistaken for nothing, the first thin edge of a sound she has not yet learned to fear. She wakes near midnight to a sound she cannot immediately place, a low, steady whistle, almost musical in its evenness, coming from somewhere outside the house. Her first thought is wind or a gap in the window frame, and she lies still a moment, listening for the sound to waver the way wind always does, rising and falling with each gust. It does not waver. It holds a single, unbroken pitch, steady as a held breath, coming from the same direction each time it swells, the fence line to the west, distinct even through her closed window and shuttered walls. She forces herself up eventually, pulling a shawl over her night clothes, and steps onto the porch into air gone sharp and still with the particular stillness of a windless desert night. The whistling continues, clear now without the house's walls to muffle it, coming unmistakably from a single stretch of fence, perhaps 60 yards to the west, though she can see no gap in the boards from this distance. No obvious reason a plain wooden fence should produce any sound at all. She does not walk toward it that first night. She stands on the porch a long while instead, arms wrapped around herself, listening to a sound with no visible source rise and fall in long, patient waves, until, sometime after 1 in the morning, it fades away entirely, leaving the night as silent as if it had never begun. She returns to bed and does not sleep again before dawn, turning over in her mind every ordinary explanation she can think of, and finding, to her own quiet unease, that none of them quite fit. In the flat gray light of morning, she walks the fence line herself. Tracing the stretch the sounds seem to come from with careful attention, running her hand along weathered boards that show no crack, no gap, nothing that should catch wind and turn it into sound. The wood is ordinary, sun-silvered, split in places by age, but structurally sound, no different from any other stretch of the same fence running north and south beyond it. She finds at the base of one particular post a patch of ground disturbed in a way the rest of the fence line is not, the earth slightly sunken, as though something beneath it long ago settled or gave way. She kneels and presses her palm to the sunken earth, feeling nothing remarkable beneath her fingers, no give, no hollow sound when she taps it with a knuckle. Still, she marks the spot in her mind, some instinct telling her it matters even though she cannot yet say why. She spends the rest of the morning in ordinary chores, unpacking the last of her trunk, inventorying the tools left behind in the barn, trying to fold the previous night's unease into the practical business of settling a new home. By midday, she has nearly convinced herself, in the safety of daylight, that a windless night can still produce sounds she simply doesn't yet understand. Some trick of temperature or terrain she'll learn to recognize with time, the way any new arrival learns the particular voice of unfamiliar land. It is a comfort that will not survive a second night of listening, but for now, in the sunlight, it is enough to let her return to her work with something like an easy mind. Silas Boone rides up mid-afternoon of her fourth day, well before she has met another living soul in the territory besides the county clerk. He is foreman at the Red Rock, spread 3 miles east, his skin weathered dark by sun, his hair a plain, unremarkable light brown, beneath a hat gone soft with wear. He sits his horse at the yard's edge a long moment before dismounting, studying the house and the fence beyond it, with the particular care of a man checking whether an old wound has healed wrong. "You bought widow's draw," he says, when she comes out to meet him. Not quite a question. "I did. Didn't figure anyone would." He says it plainly, without unkindness, though something in his tone makes her spine straighten before he said anything more specific. She invites him to water his horse, partly to be neighborly, and partly to buy herself a moment to decide how much to tell him. He accepts, and while the horse drinks, he asks her, careful as a man testing ice, whether she's heard anything unusual her first nights at the ranch. She considers lying. She doesn't. "There's a whistling," she says. "Comes from the fence line, west side. No wind to explain it." Something crosses his face at that. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he'd hoped he was wrong about. He doesn't explain it. He only tells her, before riding out, that Red Rock is close enough to reach on horseback inside 20 minutes, should she ever need to. He does not say what kind of need he has in mind. She notices, watching him go, that he never once suggested the whistling might be nothing at all. That night, the whistling returns exactly as before, rising from the same stretch of fence, at very nearly the same hour, and this time Margaret forces herself to walk toward it rather than simply listen from the porch. She carries a lamp, its small circle of light trembling ahead of her across ground gone cold and silver under a clear, moonless sky. The sound grows no louder as she approaches. If anything, it seems to soften, then thinning the closer she draws, until by the time she reaches the fence itself, it has faded to almost nothing. A bare suggestion of a note she can no longer quite locate among the ordinary boards in front of her. She stands there a long while, lamp raised, waiting for it to resume, but it stays hushed the entire time. She remains close, as though it knows precisely how near she has come and has chosen, for now, to wait her out. She turns to walk back toward the house, at last, disappointed and unsettled in equal measure, and it is only then, glancing down by chance, that her lamplight catches something new pressed into the frost-hardened ground at the base of the very post she marked that morning. A single, small, bare footprint, its edges crisp in the cold dirt, with no trail of any kind leading toward it or away from it in any direction her lamp can reach. She kneels beside it a long while in the cold, unable to look away, understanding without yet being able to explain it that whatever produces the whistling and whatever left this footprint are, in some fashion she cannot yet name, the very same thing. Julian Ashford arrives on the 9th day in a fine covered buggy that seems entirely too clean for the road it has traveled, drawn by a single well-groomed horse, driven by a silent man who never once looks toward the house. Ashford himself steps down in a charcoal suit, unmarked by dust, and introduces himself with the easy, practiced courtesy of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he arrives. Owner of the Ashford Land and Water Company, he tells her as though the title alone should explain both his presence and his confidence. He admires the property with evident sincerity, remarks on the good condition of the barn, and mentions, almost as an afterthought, that his surveys indicate a substantial underground spring beneath Widow's Draw, precisely the kind of water source his company would pay handsomely to control outright. He names a figure considerably beyond what $6 might reasonably be expected to grow into. Margaret tells him she isn't selling. Not this soon. Not before she's given the ranch a fair chance to prove itself. Ashford's smile does not falter in the slightest. Of course, Mrs. Cole, he says, softly as ever, take whatever time you require. I find that land such as this has a way of making its own case, given patience. His gaze drifts, just briefly, toward the fence line to the west before he climbs back into his buggy without further comment. He leaves as unhurried as he arrived, and Margaret stands in the yard a long moment afterward, uncertain why a man who never once raised his voice or made an explicit threat has left her hands cold and unsteady at her sides. The small herd of cattle she's had driven up from town lasts less than a week before trouble finds them. She wakes on the 5th night to a commotion unlike anything she's yet heard on the property. Hooves pounding rails, a chorus of low, panicked bawling that pulls her from bed and into the yard with a lamp before she's fully dressed. She finds the small corral in chaos, the animals pressed as far from the western fence as the enclosure allows, eyes white-rimmed with fear, refusing to come near even for her. She walks the perimeter with her lamp raised and finds nothing to account for it. No predator, no snake, nothing beyond the ordinary shapes of desert night, stretching away toward the very fence line that has already given her 2 nights of unexplained sound. In the morning, examining the ground in full daylight, she finds fresh bare footprints pressed into the dirt just inside the corral fence, pointed toward where the terrified cattle had huddled. The same small, crisp, trailless prints she found at the western post days before, appearing here now as though whatever leaves them has begun to range beyond its original stretch of fence. She does not yet mention this to Silas when he next rides by. She is beginning to understand, without wanting to, that speaking it aloud to him will only confirm what she is not yet ready to have confirmed for herself. Word travels quickly between the few ranches this far out, and Silas hears of the spooked cattle before Margaret ever brings herself to say anything. He rides over that same evening and goes straight to the corral, rather than lingering at the yard's edge, crouching at the fence rail to examine it with the same careful attention he'd give a wound. Nothing broke here, he says finally, but they were pushed hard against it from the inside. Something scared them bad, and it wasn't anything with 4 legs, or fur, or there'd be tracks besides those. He nods toward the small, bare footprints still visible near the fence. Margaret tells him, finally, about the whistling, the western fence post, the sunken earth beneath it, the print she found there the same night this one appeared. Silas listens without interrupting, his expression carefully still, and when she finishes, he's quiet long enough that she asks him outright whether he knows something about this land he hasn't told her. "I know what most folks around here know," he says slowly, which isn't much, but isn't nothing either. "There's a woman 2 ranches over, Ruth Calder, kept house for the family that had this place before it sat empty. You ought to talk to her, not me. I wasn't here for any of it." Before he leaves, he offers to help repair the corral properly and to stay close in case the trouble worsens, the nearest thing, in these early weeks, to an admission that he believes her entirely, and the nearest thing Margaret allows herself to admitting how much she needs someone to. Ashford returns before she manages to seek out Ruth Calder, arriving this time on horseback alone, but for his usual silent driver, trailing at a respectful distance. He finds her mending the corral fence herself, and watches her work a moment before speaking, as though her labor only confirms something he'd already assumed. "I hear you've had some trouble with your stock," he says, gently as always. "A shame. This is difficult country for anyone unfamiliar with its particular moods." He lets the word particular sit there a moment longer than comfort allows. Margaret asks him plainly what exactly he means by that. "Only that ranching tests everyone equally," he says, spreading his hands in a gesture of perfect reasonableness. Harder still, perhaps, for a woman new to the territory, on land with something of a history. He renews his offer generously, and she refuses him again, flatly this time, and something briefly tightens behind his composed expression before smoothing back into its usual calm. "As you wish," he says. "I'm a patient man, Mrs. Cole." He pauses before turning to go. "You should know, purely as information, that my company employs a great many hands who travel these roads at all hours in the course of their work. Should you notice riders near your property after dark, I'd ask you not to be alarmed. They mean you no trouble whatsoever." He rides away before she can ask why he felt the need to mention it at all. The same unease Cross's counterpart in another territory might have left behind him, settling now over Widow's Draw exactly as patiently as he promised. That night, for the first time, Margaret sees riders of her own, 3 horsemen moving slow and deliberate along the road beyond her property line, circling without ever quite crossing onto her land, visible by moonlight from her bedroom window well past midnight. She cannot make out their faces. She does not need to, understanding immediately whose hands they must be. In the morning, she finds the corral gates standing open, unlatched rather than broken, the small herd scattered nearly to the tree line. By the time she discovers it, it takes the better part of the day, with Silas's help once he arrives, to gather the animals back within the repaired fence. Latch didn't fail itself, Silas says, examining it closely. Someone worked this open deliberate. Margaret tells him about the riders. Margaret tells him about the riders, and his expression darkens in a controlled way she hasn't seen from him before. Not fear, but a quiet, simmering anger, held carefully in check. Ashford doesn't do his own dirty work, he says, but he's got no shortage of men willing to do quiet favors for what he pays. He looks toward the western fence line, toward the very post where the whistling first began. Doesn't mean everything happening out here is his doing, though. Some of it isn't his to claim at all. It is the clearest acknowledgement yet, spoken plainly between them for the first time, that two entirely separate troubles have converged on Widow's Draw Ranch, only one of which, whatever its cruelty, wears an ordinary human face. Margaret begins keeping a careful record after that. A plain ledger bought on her next trip to town, its pages filled with dates, hours, and precise descriptions of everything she cannot otherwise account for. The whistling and its steady, unwavering pitch. The footprints appearing without trail at the western post, then at the corral, then once, disturbingly, on the porch steps themselves. The riders at the property line, 3 of them, always at night, never quite crossing onto her land. She begins noticing smaller disturbances too, the kind she might once have dismissed as simple forgetfulness. A door she was certain she'd latched, found standing open at dawn. The child's rag doll in the front room moved from the settee to the floor more than once, though nothing else in the room is ever disturbed alongside it. She writes it all down less because she expects the record to prove anything to anyone else, and more because the act of writing steadies her, turning the shapeless dread of her nights into something with dates and margins, something small enough to close inside a book and set upon a shelf until morning. She does not write down how tired she has become, how she sometimes catches herself standing at a window before she remembers walking there, how the line between fear and simple exhaustion has begun, in recent nights, to blur in ways that frighten her nearly as much as the whistling itself. She resolves, closing the ledger on the 12th night, to ride out and find Ruth Calder before the week is through, certain now that whatever answers exist for Widow's Draw are old ones, far older than Ashford and his offers. The nights worsen before she can make good on that resolve. On the 13th night, she wakes not to whistling but to something nearer, a single slow footstep on the porch boards directly outside her window, followed by a silence so complete it seems to carry its own weight. She lies frozen a long while before forcing herself to the door, lamp raised, and finds nothing. No horse at the rail, no figure retreating across the yard. Only, at the very edge of her lamplight, a fresh bare footprint pressed into the porch wood itself, in grain that should hold no such impression at all. She does not sleep the remainder of that night, sitting instead at the kitchen table with a lit lamp and her late husband's revolver laid within reach, though she trusts her own hand on it only slightly more than she trusts whatever waits beyond her walls. Toward dawn, exhausted past clear fear, she believes she hears, faintly, from somewhere past the western fence, a low sound almost like breath, drawn out slow and even, entirely unlike wind, gone again before she can be certain she heard it at all. In the gray light of morning, examining the porch on legs stiff from a night spent upright, she finds the print already beginning to fade. The wood grain reasserting itself just as the dust always does at the fence line. Whatever leaves these marks, she is coming to understand. Does not wish to be found outright. It wishes only to be almost found, to leave just enough behind to be certain never enough to be believed by anyone who has not stood exactly where she now stands. Ruth Calder lives in a small house at the edge of town, close enough that Margaret rides in alone the following morning, ledger tucked beneath her arm. Ruth is older than Margaret expected, perhaps 70, her hands marked by decades of hard work, her eyes pale but sharp, with a clarity that suggests she has never once stopped thinking about whatever brought Margaret to her door. She does not seem surprised by the visit. If anything, she seems almost relieved that it has finally come, inviting Margaret inside and pouring coffee with hands that tremble only slightly. "Widow's draw," she says, before Margaret has finished introducing herself. "Knew somebody would take it eventually. Good land, whatever else walks it." For a long moment she says nothing further, studying Margaret's face as though searching it for the same fear she must once have seen in someone else's a very long time ago. "You've heard the whistling," she says finally. "It is not a question." "Every night," Margaret admits, "and I've found footprints I can't explain, at the fence and elsewhere besides." Ruth nods slowly, as though this only confirms something long since settled in her own mind. "Bare feet," she says, "start nowhere, end nowhere." Margaret's breath catches at hearing her own private observation spoken back to her so precisely. "How do you know that?" she asks. "Because I saw the very same," Ruth says, "the winter the Dunmore family disappeared. And I've spent 12 years since, hoping to God nobody would ever have cause to ask me about it again. The Dunmore family took widow's draw in the spring of 1875, Ruth explains. A husband, a wife, and a young daughter, ordinary as any family, working ordinary land. Ruth herself kept house for them from their very first season, glad of steady work close to town. For nearly 2 years, nothing at all was amiss. The land proved fair, the well reliable, the family industrious, and, by every appearance, content with their modest prospects. The trouble began, Ruth says. The autumn the family decided to dig a second well nearer the western fence line, hoping for water closer to hand than the original well behind the house. The digging crew struck something below the surface that was neither rock, nor water, nor anything a well ought properly to strike. An old, narrow shaft, walled in a manner none of the diggers could account for, far older than anything else in the young territory's short history. Unsettled by it, and unable to explain it, the crew filled the shaft back in within days and refused to continue the work at any price. It was after that, Ruth says, not before, that the whistling began each night from the very stretch of fence nearest where the shaft had been found. That the Dunmore's young daughter began waking with the same wordless fright that would trouble Margaret's own cattle a dozen years later. That footprints began appearing along the fence line each morning, bare and small, beginning and ending nowhere at all. Mr. Dunmore dug that shaft back open himself. Later, Ruth says quietly, against his wife's clear wishes, wanted to see for himself what the diggers wouldn't describe to him fully. I never learned what he found there, if he found anything at all. 3 weeks after, the whole family was simply gone. Margaret asks the question she has been circling since Ruth began speaking. Gone? How? Gone? Where? Ruth is quiet. A long moment before answering, her voice gone thin with the effort of returning to a memory she has spent 12 years trying to leave behind. I came up that last morning, same as any other, she says, found the door standing wide open, in the middle of a hard winter, the stove still banked with coals, breakfast half laid on the table, their horses still fed and watered in the barn from the night before. No sign of struggle anywhere in that house, nothing missing but the family itself. Not their coin, not their good coats, not one thing a family fleeing real trouble would think to grab first. Just gone, Margaret says quietly. Just gone, Ruth agrees. We searched 3 days with half the men from Red Rock and half the town besides. Found one thing worth finding out along the fence line where it runs west toward open desert, headed away from the house in the dead of winter with no boots on any of their feet. She meets Margaret's eyes directly. Prints, same as you found. Clear as anything for near 40 yards, and then stopped dead all at once, like whoever made them simply stopped, existing mid-stride. No trail back, no place they could have gone from there without someone in that search line, seeing them cross open snow for near a mile in every direction. She falls silent, and Margaret understands she has just been told, as plainly as an old woman's grief will allow, that the Dunmore family did not flee Widow's Draw Ranch. They simply, impossibly, stopped being anywhere at all. Margaret asks, before she leaves, what became of the shaft the digging crew first uncovered near the fence. Filled in a second time after, Ruth tells her, County sent men out eventually, more for the look of trying than any real belief they'd find a vanished family alive. They found the shaft Dunmore had reopened, filled it in once more, and told the town it was nothing but an old mining prospect, long abandoned. Nobody who'd actually stood at its edge believed a word of that report, but it let the county close its books and it let the town stop asking questions. And that suited most everyone well enough. Whereabouts exactly? Margaret asks. Along the fence. Ruth's eyes hold hers a moment before answering. West side, maybe 60 yards south of the old well. You'll know the ground when you find it. Nothing's grown proper there in 12 years. Not since the second filling, and I doubt anything ever will. She warns Margaret then, more directly than she has warned her of anything else that morning. Leave that ground be whatever the whistling costs her in sleep. Whatever moved through the Dunmore family's life once that shaft was disturbed, Ruth believes, with the plain conviction of a woman who has had 12 years to settle her mind on the matter, it remains down there still, patient, capable of being roused again by anyone determined enough or desperate enough to go looking a second time. Margaret thanks her and rides home in a silence she does not try to fill, already turning over, in her own private way, whether she can bring herself to heed that warning for as long as she remains at Widow's Draw. That night, alone again at the ranch, Margaret adds Ruth's account to her ledger in full. The digging crew, the reopened shaft, the Dunmore family's disappearance, the 12 years of silence that followed. She finds herself, for the first time since her arrival, less frightened than resolved. A haunting without history is a thing simply to endure or flee. A haunting with history, a specific patch of ground, a specific old wound reopened once already, is a thing that might conceivably be understood, even if it can never be undone. She does not yet know what she intends to do with this understanding. She knows only that she cannot spend the remainder of her life lying awake each night, measuring an unbroken whistle against her own fear, waiting for whatever visited the Dunmores to decide her fate in turn. The whistling rises that night exactly as it always has, and for the first time, she does not flinch at the sound so much as truly listen to it, counting the length of its rise and fall the way she once counted a rival sound in another territory's story of bells, wondering whether its steady, unwavering pitch carries some meaning she has simply lacked the patience to decode. It never wavers. It never grows louder or softer by more than the smallest degree. A single held note, night after night, as constant and patient as the ground it rises from. She falls asleep at last with the ledger still open on her lap, and dreams, though she will not recall the dream clearly by morning, of walking the fence line south past the old well toward ground she has not yet visited in waking hours, following a whistle that seems, in the dream at least, to know exactly where it means to lead her. She rides out 3 days later to the stretch of fence Ruth described, Silas beside her at her own insistence, both of them uneasy despite the plain daylight around them. The ground changes noticeably as they approach, grass thinning to nothing, the earth beneath their horses' hooves gone pale and crack despite 12 seasons of rain since anyone last disturbed it deliberately. The horses grow reluctant well short of the fence line itself, ears pinned, refusing to be urged closer, and both riders dismount to continue on foot rather than force the animals further. The old shaft, when they find it, lies almost flush with the ground, marked mostly by a shallow depression in the earth no more than 4 feet across, its edges lined with stone too regular, too deliberately shaped to match anything else in the surrounding landscape, worn smooth by an age that seems to reach back, far beyond 12 years, far beyond even the oldest structures either of them has seen in this territory. County filled this in twice by Ruth's account. Silas says quietly, crouching at its edge without touching it, "Doesn't look filled to me at all." It doesn't. The depression lies open to the sky, its depths lost in shadow, even at midday, giving off a faint, cool breath of air that neither of them can account for by any ordinary explanation. Neither moves closer. Some instinct older than reason keeps them both a careful distance back, and, for once, neither is inclined to argue with it, standing together in silence a long while before finally turning back toward their waiting horses. They ride back toward the house, mostly in silence. Silas visibly turning something over in his mind the whole way, until finally, well within sight of the ranch buildings, he speaks what has plainly been sitting with him since they left the shaft. "My grandmother used to say there's ground in this territory older than any of us," he says. "Older than the missions, older than any story the tribes out here have for it either. Ground you're better off riding around than riding through." He glances at her, never put much stock in that kind of talk. Growing up on cattle work, didn't leave much room for it. And now, Margaret asks. He doesn't answer directly. Now I've seen cattle scared half to death by nothing at all, and a hole in the ground that 2 proper county fillings couldn't manage to keep shut. Don't know what that adds up to. No, it isn't nothing, though. Margaret tells him, as they ride, about the dream, the whistle leading her south along the fence toward ground she hadn't yet consciously chosen to visit. Silas takes this in without dismissing it, though he offers no theory of his own for what it might mean. By the time they reach the house, the whistling has already begun its nightly rise from the western fence, steady and unbroken as ever, and for the first time, Silas stays to hear it directly himself rather than simply take her word for it. Neither of them speaks for a long while, standing together in the dark yard, listening to a single held note rise and fall with a patience neither one of them can begin to explain. Ashford's men grow bolder in the days that follow, emboldened, it seems, by whatever fear the ranch itself already provides them to work alongside, rather than compete against. Margaret catches one outright on the 16th night, a rider dismounted near her well, tools in hand, tampering with the pump mechanism under cover of darkness, and only her own sleeplessness lets her catch him at it, lamp raised, ordering him off her land, in a voice steadier than she feels. He flees before she can make out his face clearly, leaving behind a dropped tool stamped plainly with the mark of the Ashford Land and Water Company's equipment depot, evidence concrete enough that even a sympathetic judge could not easily wave it aside. She rides to Silas the following morning, with the tool in hand, and together they agree it is time to act on the human threat directly, whatever remains unresolved about the other. Silas knows an honest deputy in town, unlikely to be swayed by Ashford's considerable influence over the rest of the county's affairs. She rides in herself 2 days later, tool in her saddlebag and ledger under her arm, prepared for the first time to lay out carefully and specifically the pattern of harassment she has endured since refusing Ashford's offer, while remaining, by her own deliberate choice, entirely silent about the whistling, the footprints, and the old shaft to the west. That part of her account, she has decided, belongs to her alone and would do her case no favors in a territorial courtroom. The deputy listens gravely to her account and examines the tool with plain interest, promising to look quietly into the matter without tipping Ashford's hand that he is under any particular suspicion just yet. It is a small victory, but a genuine one. The first ground Margaret has gained against either threat pressing on Widow's Draw since her arrival. Ashford does not take well to the quiet inquiries that follow, whatever discretion Margaret and Silas had hoped might buy them. He calls on her again within the week, and for the first time his composure shows the faintest crack. Not anger exactly, never quite anger, but a colder, more precise version of his usual patience. "I understand there's been some unpleasantness," he says, seated uninvited at her own table. "Accusations against my company. I do hope you haven't been hasty, Mrs. Cole. Hasty accusations tend to complicate matters for everyone involved. I found your company's tool at my well," Margaret says. "That isn't an accusation. That's evidence." His smile thins but holds. "Tools go missing from job sites constantly," he says smoothly. "Employees, too, are not always the caliber of men one would wish for." He rises to leave, smoothing his coat with unhurried precision. "I would ask you to consider whether pursuing this serves you well." This is difficult country for a woman alone, difficult country entirely, if certain of its older troubles are stirred up unwisely. His gaze drifts, briefly, unmistakably, toward the western fence. "I'd hate to see you lose more to this land than you already stand to." The sense that he knows something of the ranch's older history, that unsettles her more than any threat he has spoken outright. She asks Ruth, on a second visit made alone, whether the Ashford Company had ever shown interest in Widow's Draw before the Dunmore family vanished. Ruth's face darkens at the question in a way Margaret hasn't seen from her before. "Ashford's father ran the water company before him," she says slowly. "And yes, there was interest in too. Surveymen came through the year before that digging crew found the old shaft. His father wanted this spring bad as the son wants it now. Made Dunmore an offer, same as his sons made you. Dunmore turned it down flat, same as you have. And then the shaft was found," Margaret says, "and then they vanished." Ruth doesn't answer that directly, but her silence carries its own answer. "I've wondered, some nights," she says finally, "whether that digging crew was sent to that exact spot on purpose. Whether somebody hoped disturbing whatever slept down there might drive the Dunmores off quicker than any offer of money ever could." She shakes her head. "Never could prove a thing like that. Still wonder, all the same." Margaret rides home, turning this over, the possibility that Ashford's family, one generation removed, may have deliberately unearthed whatever sleeps beneath Widow's Draw's western fence. Gambling that fear alone might accomplish what money could not, making the son not merely an opportunist circling a haunted property, but something closer to its original architect. The nights grow harder to endure as the investigation presses forward on both fronts at once. The whistling continues without fail. The footprints keep their patient, trailless appearances at the fence, and once more on the porch. And one night, near 3 in the morning, Margaret and Silas both wake to the sound of the front door creaking open on its own, though it stood latched when they retired. They find the child's rag doll, on checking the front room, moved once more from the settee to the floor, propped upright now facing the window that looks out toward the western fence. Though neither of them has touched it in weeks, neither speaks of it directly. Both understand, without needing to say so aloud, that whatever haunts Widow's Draw Ranch has never confined itself strictly to the fence line. It has always, perhaps, considered the house itself part of its territory, too. The deputy's quiet investigation bears fruit at last a few nights later. Word reaches Silas that one of Ashford's hands has been caught outright tampering with a neighboring ranch's water supply. Evidence enough, combined with the tool from Margaret's own well, to build a case that even a wealthy man's lawyers will struggle to dismiss entirely. The hand, facing real charges, begins to talk. He confirms what Margaret and Silas had already suspected, a deliberate campaign against Widow's Draw specifically, meant to frighten her into selling at a fraction of the land's true worth. What he cannot explain, what visibly unsettles even him, is the whistling itself. He will not admit to ever approaching the western fence at night, describing an unwillingness that goes well beyond simple caution. The trial comes swiftly by the standards of territorial justice. Ashford's wealth buys him better counsel than his own hired hand, but it cannot erase a company-stamped tool found at Margaret's well, nor silence a man already facing separate charges of his own, nor undo the deputy's careful documentation of weeks of patrol logs gathered across more than one affected property. Margaret testifies herself, calm and precise, laying out the pattern of harassment in the same careful dated fashion she has kept in her ledger since her 12th night at the ranch, saying nothing at all, still, of the whistling or the fence or the shaft to the west. That part of her account remains, by her own deliberate choice, entirely her own to carry. Ashford sits through the proceedings with his usual unshaken composure, and it is only in the final moment, as the verdict is read against him, guilty of conspiracy to harass and intimidate, fined heavily and barred from further water claims in the county for a period of years, that his mask slips just once, just barely, before smoothing back into practiced calm. He approaches her once more outside the courthouse, alone, his voice soft and measured as always. "You've won, Mrs. Cole," he says. "I congratulate you, and I hope the land proves worth what it's cost you." His eyes hold hers a moment longer than comfort allows. "I do wonder whether you've considered that I was never the whole of what troubles Widow's Draw, only the part a courtroom can touch." He walks away without waiting for her answer, leaving her standing on the courthouse steps with a victory that feels, for the first time, exactly as incomplete as he clearly intended it to feel. The weeks following Ashford's conviction bring the first real peace Margaret has known at Widow's Draw. The riders vanish from the property line entirely. The well stands untampered every morning. The small herd grazes undisturbed by anything resembling deliberate human mischief. But the whistling continues exactly as before, rising each night from the same stretch of western fence, without fail unwavering in pitch, patient as the ground it rises from. The footprints continue their trailless appearances too, at the fence, occasionally the porch, always small, always bare, always beginning and ending in ground and wood that should hold no such impression at all. Silas stays on more nights than not by now, an arrangement neither of them has formally named but both have quietly settled into. He no longer pretends the whistling might have a mundane explanation waiting to be found. Neither does she. Both have come, in their own separate and private ways, to accept that Widow's Draw Ranch will simply always whistle at midnight, whatever else changes about the lives lived within its fences. Margaret rides out once more to the old shaft, alone this time, standing at the same careful distance she and Silas once kept together. The bare ground has not changed. The faint, cool breath still rises from its depths. She writes, that night, a final entry regarding the human conflict at Widow's Draw, resolved. Beside it, in the same steady hand, she adds a second line regarding the other matter, the older matter, the matter no courtroom in the territory could ever be asked to rule upon, unresolved, and she susps closing the ledger, unresolvable by any means available to her. Ruth Calder passes quietly that winter, in her sleep, at the age of 71, and Margaret rides to her modest funeral, with Silas at her side, feeling keenly the particular grief of losing the one person who had truly understood, from the beginning, exactly what she had purchased for $6. At the small gathering afterward, an old friend of Ruth's takes Margaret aside and tells her something Ruth herself had apparently never shared, even with Silas's family, that, in her final years, unable to sleep some nights for thinking of the Dunmores, Ruth had taken to riding out to the edge of Widow's Draw herself, simply to listen from a safe distance to the whistling's steady, unbroken pitch. Said it comforted her. Strange as it sounds, the old friend tells Margaret, said as long as it kept its same note, exactly the same every night, she figured whatever was down in that ground was content just to mark its presence, wasn't reaching any further than it already had. Worried more, she told me once about the nights it might change, rise higher, go silent altogether. She pats Margaret's hand. Carried that worry 12 years, dear. Don't know if that's a comfort to you. Don't know if that's a comfort to you, knowing it or not. Margaret turns the words over for days afterward, realizing she has, without quite choosing to, come to measure her own nights the very same way, not by whether the whistling comes, which she has long since accepted as fact, but by whether it holds its familiar, unchanging note, the same note the Dunmore family once heard a dozen years before her, the same note she supposes some future owner of Widow's Draw may yet hear a dozen years after she herself is gone from it. Silas asks her to marry him on a clear evening in early spring, standing in the yard between the house and the western fence, close enough to hear in the early hours before the whistling typically begins. An unusual and almost deliberate feeling silence from that direction. Margaret says yes without hesitation, a certainty that surprises her less than she expected, given how carefully she has guarded herself since her first husband's death. Silas Boone has spent the better part of a year proving himself steady in ways requiring no further proof by now. Steady through spooked cattle and courtroom testimony alike. Steady through countless nights spent listening beside her to a sound neither of them can explain. Steady in the particular, unglamorous way of a man who simply keeps showing up, regardless of what the night brings. They plan a small wedding at Widow's Draw itself for the following month, a choice some in town quietly question given the ranch's reputation, but one Margaret insists upon without needing to explain herself further to anyone but Silas. This land, whatever else it is, has become entirely hers in every sense that matters to her now. Silas asks her only once, gently, whether she's certain that beginning a shared life on ground that whistles at midnight without explanation is truly the choice she wants to make. The alternative, Margaret tells him, is spending the rest of my life running from a sound I already ran once. After my husband died from a place I could no longer bear to stay in, I don't intend to run again. She looks toward the fence, quiet for now in the fading evening light. It hasn't hurt me, not once in a year of nights. I've decided I can live beside a mystery if I must. I won't live in fear of one any longer. Before the wedding, Margaret makes a decision she has turned over in her mind for weeks. She asks a small crew from town to tear out and replace the entire stretch of fence nearest the old shaft, board by board, new lumber for old, in some private hope that fresh wood over undisturbed ground might finally break whatever pattern has held for 12 years running. Silas helps oversee the work himself, and the crew, paid well and told only that the old boards had grown unsound, makes quick work of it over 3 days, pulling weathered gray planks free and setting fresh, pale lumber in their place. Along the same 60-yard stretch where the whistling has always risen strongest, Margaret watches the new boards go up with a feeling she can't quite name, some private hope she hasn't admitted even to Silas, that new wood, untouched by whatever history clings to the old, might simply stand silent where its predecessor never could. The crew finishes by evening of the 3rd day, paid and sent on their way, the fresh planks pale and raw-looking against the sun-silvered gray of the boards running on either side of them. That night, the wedding only days away now, Margaret and Silas stand together at the yard's edge as full dark falls, both of them watching the new stretch of fence with the same unspoken, cautious hope, waiting to see whether midnight will finally arrive at Widow's Draw Ranch in genuine, unbroken silence for the very first time since Margaret's arrival. Midnight comes, and for nearly 20 minutes past it, the new fence holds its silence. Margaret allows herself, standing beside Silas in the cool dark, the cautious beginning of real hope, that perhaps disturbing nothing further, replacing only the wood and leaving the ground itself untouched beneath it, has been enough after all. Then it comes, faint at first, rising slowly from the same 60-yard stretch, unmistakably the same steady, unwavering pitch it has always held, as though the fresh pale lumber makes no difference whatsoever to whatever produces the sound beneath it. Margaret closes her eyes a long moment, absorbing this quietly rather than with the sharp fear she once would have felt. New wood, Silas says softly beside her. Not quite a question. New wood, Margaret agrees. Same whistle. They stand together a while longer, listening to the unchanged, patient note rise and fall, exactly as it always has, and Margaret understands now with a clarity that feels almost like relief after so many months of uncertainty, that whatever lies beneath that stretch of fence was never truly bound to the old boards at all. The wood was never the source. The wood was only ever what carried the sound to human ears able to hear it. She takes Silas's hand in the dark, and neither of them suggests, even quietly, that the wedding be delayed or the location changed. They have both, in their own separate ways, made their peace with what Widow's Draw Ranch has decided to keep for itself, regardless of what changes hands above the ground it holds. The wedding takes place on a warm evening in early spring, held in the yard between the house and the newly replaced fence, attended by a modest gathering of neighbors, the sympathetic deputy, and the handful of townsfolk who have, over the past year, come to see Margaret coalesce as the foolish woman who bought a troubled ranch for $6 and more, as the steady woman who fought off a wealthy man's campaign of intimidation and won outright. Ruth's absence is felt keenly by both Margaret and Silas, though neither speaks of it during the ceremony itself. Margaret has, in her own quiet way, made peace with carrying Ruth's knowledge forward without her. The ledger now safely locked away, a private record she intends someday to pass on to whoever next takes responsibility for this land after her. The ceremony passes without incident, vows exchanged in the golden hour before full dark, laughter and modest celebration afterward around a fire built near enough to the house to keep the evening's chill at bay. For the first time since her arrival at Widow's Draw, Margaret allows herself, for a few hours at least, to simply be happy, a woman married again to a good man on land unquestionably, however strangely, her own. It is only as the last guests depart, well after dark, that she catches Silas's eye across the quieting yard and reads in his expression the same thought, sitting unspoken at the edge of her own mind all evening, that the new fence has not yet whistled tonight, that the yard has stood in unbroken silence through vows and celebration alike. Neither of them says anything about it aloud. Both privately wonder whether tonight, of all nights, might finally prove the exception. The last guests take their leave a little past 10, wagons rattling off down the property road until the sound fades entirely, and Widow's Draw stands quiet beneath a clear, star-heavy sky. Margaret and Silas linger by the dying fire a while longer, speaking softly of small things, the wedding, the coming season, modest plans for expanding the herd, now that the property's human troubles lie fully behind them. Silas banks the fire himself before they finally turn toward the house, his arm around her shoulders in the cooling night air, and for a long moment, walking together across the yard, Margaret allows herself the small luxury of believing that perhaps, on this one night at least, whatever sleeps beneath the western fence has chosen to grant them silence as a kind of wedding gift. She glances toward the fence as they pass it, more from habit now than fear, a full year of nights having taught her to check, however briefly, before turning in each evening. The new pale boards stand exactly as they were left, undisturbed, silent, no different in the moonlight from any ordinary stretch of fencing on any ordinary ranch. Nothing sounds, nothing moves. The night holds its unusual, unbroken quiet, and Margaret climbs the porch steps beside her new husband with something almost like hope taking cautious root in her chest. Hope that tonight might mark some quiet, unspoken turning point in the ranch's 12-year-old rhythm. They retire not long after, the house settling into the particular stillness of a home, finally fully at rest. No lamp left burning through the night this time, for the first time in longer than Margaret can easily recall, both of them trusting, however cautiously, in the evening's unbroken silence so far. Margaret drifts toward sleep slowly, aware in some distant corner of her mind of small, ordinary sounds. Silas's steady breathing beside her, the house's familiar settling creaks, the faint stirring of a night breeze against the shutters. None of it carries the particular wrongness she has learned over a year of nights to recognize instantly, even half asleep. She allows herself, drifting further toward true rest, the rare comfort of believing that perhaps this is simply how it ends. Not with dramatic confrontation, not with the mystery finally solved and named, but simply with time itself wearing the pattern smooth, the way 12 years had already softened whatever grief or anger first set the fence whistling after the Dunmore family's disappearance. Perhaps a wedding, new lumber, a new name upon the land is enough to grant Widow's Draw its first full night of peace in over a decade. She sleeps deeply for the first time in longer than she can remember, held in the particular exhausted peace of a woman who has, after a long and difficult year, finally allowed herself to simply rest completely. The house around her stands silent. The yard beyond it stands silent. For hours, the only sounds at Widow's Draw Ranch are the ordinary sounds of a working ranch at rest until sometime past midnight, in the deepest hour of the night, that silence very quietly, very gently begins to end. Margaret wakes alone in the dark, though she could not afterwards say precisely what woke her. No sound loud enough to startle, nothing so much as a single distinct note at first, only a change in the quality of the silence itself, the particular shift in a room's air that tells a sleeping mind, before the waking mind catches up, that something has begun again. Silas sleeps on beside her, undisturbed, his breathing even and deep, and for a moment she lies still in the dark, listening, uncertain whether she has truly woken to anything at all. Then it comes, faint, distant, unmistakable, a single thin note rising from the direction of the new fence, soft and testing at first, as though something out there in the dark is only now beginning to stir after a full year, a full 12 years before that, of patient, unbroken habit. Margaret sits up slowly in the dark, careful not to wake Silas, and finds herself, after everything, the fear, the ledger, the courtroom, the wedding, just hours behind her, strangely, quietly calm. She has spent a year learning that this sound cannot be stopped, cannot be explained, cannot be bargained with or replaced away with fresh lumber over old ground. She decided months ago that she can live beside it. Sitting in the dark on her wedding night, listening for the note to rise fully, she finds that she meant it entirely. It swells a moment later into its full, familiar pitch, steady and unwavering, exactly as it has always been, the same patient tone she first heard on her very first night at Widow's Draw, reasserting itself now as though it had never truly paused at all, only waited with whatever patience such a thing possesses for the ceremony and the celebration and the small mortal happiness of the day to finish playing out above the ground it has claimed as its own. She rises quietly from the bed, careful not to disturb Silas's sleep, and crosses to the window rather than the door this time, some instinct telling her that tonight she will only listen, not walk out to confront it as she once did in her earliest, more frightened weeks on this land. The yard beyond the glass lies washed in pale moonlight. The new fence, a pale line against the darker scrub beyond it, its exact source of sound impossible to locate even at this distance, precisely as it has always been impossible to locate up close as well. But it carries plainly across the still night air regardless, steady and unbroken, the same patient note she has heard every night for a full year now, the very note Ruth Calder once wrote out simply to listen to, finding in its very sameness a strange and specific comfort of her own. Margaret watches for a long while, the moonlit yard perfectly still, but for the invisible source of that steady sound, no shape emerging anywhere along the fence line, no footprint yet visible in the pale dust at this distance, nothing to see at all beyond the ordinary shape of an ordinary ranch at midnight, and yet the whistling continues, deliberate and undeniable, exactly as it always has been. She does not wake Silas. She simply stands at the window in her nightclothes, watching an empty yard, listening to a fence that produces sound from no visible source on the first night of her second marriage, and finds that after everything, the fear, the grief, the courtroom victory, the year of learning to live beside a question with no answer, she is no longer counting the minutes to measure her fear. She is simply listening now, the way one listens to any familiar ordinary sound, belonging entirely to the place she calls home. The whistling fades, after perhaps 10 minutes, exactly as it always fades, not stopping abruptly, but growing quieter by degrees until the yard settles back into full, ordinary silence. Margaret remains at the window a while longer, watching for any final sign. A footprint, blooming suddenly in pale dust, any shift at all along the fence line, but nothing appears. The yard holds its silence as completely as if nothing at all had disturbed it. She returns to bed at last, sliding carefully beneath the quilt beside Silas, who stirs briefly, but does not fully wake. She lies beside him in the dark, staring at the ceiling, turning over. Not for the first time, and she suspects not for the last, the question she has long since stopped expecting to answer. What precisely produces that sound tonight and every night before it? What precisely left those footprints in dust and porchwood alike? What precisely waits, patient and old, beneath the western fence? Content, it seems, simply to mark its presence rather than reach any further than it apparently ever has. Morning comes clear in ordinary sunlight, pouring gold across the yard, exactly as it has every morning since her arrival. Margaret rises before Silas, dresses, and walks out to the porch with her coffee, looking out over land that is entirely, legally, unquestionably hers. Hers by $6 and a year of hard-won survival. Hers by a courtroom victory over a wealthy man's cruelty. And hers, too, by some other claim she will never be able to name or prove, running in both directions at once. Her ownership of the land and the land's own quiet, patient ownership of something in return. She does not walk out to the fence this morning to check for footprints. She knows, without looking, that if she walked out there now, she would likely find one, small and bare and beginning nowhere, already softening at its edges in the morning light, exactly as they always have. She stays instead on the porch, coffee cooling in her hands, watching the ordinary gold light climb higher over ground that holds both an answerable and an unanswerable history within its fences. One closed now, resolved in a courtroom, its architect punished and banished. The other, older by far, patient beyond any human reckoning of patience, content, it seems, simply, to go on singing its single unbroken note, quietly, faithfully, every midnight, for reasons that belong entirely to itself, until tonight comes again, and with it, exactly as it always has, exactly as perhaps it always will, the fence that whistles alone.